CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Robin Dwyer.
And I'm Juliet Mann. Our top stories. Doubling down on climate commitments, President Joe Biden says the US will meet its emissions targets by 2030.
Asian shares soar after China eases some of its COVID restrictions.
Recession looms for the UK as the economy starts to shrink. The Bank of England says it could last 2 years.
Cryptocurrency exchange FTX files for bankruptcy and its boss steps down after a week of huge turmoil for the company.
And a Ducati double. Italian success on the track and in the showrooms as sales roar into top gear in China.
President Joe Biden says the United States will meet its emissions targets by 2030 as he addressed the COP27 climate conference in Egypt.
Biden told world leaders the global climate crisis poses an existential threat to the planet and promised the US was doing its part to combat it. Our correspondent Adel Al-Mahrouki is in Sharm el-Sheikh where COP27 is taking place. And good to see you, Adel. What else did Biden have to say?
Well, President Biden insisted that all participants in the COP, basically the world, to take climate more seriously, citing that climate change and the failing to reach emissions and reduce carbon footprint will lead not only to extreme weather, but also economic implications. It will jeopardize national security of nations, stability, and life on Earth in general. And it comes as he announces a bundle of financial support between the United States and the European Union together. They will be funding developing countries in their mitigation and adaptation plan. He namely mentioned the host Egypt with a bundle of joint support from both from the United States and the EU with about $500 million for Egypt alone. And it comes as Joe Biden puts a highlight on the significance of this COP, the COP of implementation. Let's have more to what he has said.
We're proving that good climate policy is good economic policy. It's a strong foundation for durable, resilient, inclusive economic growth. It's driving progress in the private sector. It's driving progress around the world. And the sum total of the actions my administration is taking puts the United States on track to achieve our Paris Agreement goal of reducing emissions 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by 2005 levels by 2030.
So some bold ambitions from the United States, but how close are we to getting a broader consensus on climate issues?
It's very early to say. We're still in the middle of the negotiations and talks. This is just the third day in terms of the thematic topics that each day a certain topic is being addressed. And these are the number of the most crucial issues that the planet is facing, basically. And so far, it seems some tracks are seeing progress, especially those in addressing losses and damage, where we've seen European countries starting to promise financial support to that article alone. We have so far about 3 or 4 countries have so far promised something like over $200 million. It's not much, but it is a step. Meanwhile, we're also seeing trouble from other sides where some African countries insist that they will tap to their oil and gas reserves. They don't want any restrictions to their fossil fuel consumption, as that will directly impact their poverty and economic growth.
Adel, thank you. Adel Al-Mahrouki, our correspondent in Sharm el-Sheikh at COP27. Thank you.
Global fossil fuel emissions will hit a record high this year, making it harder for the world to avoid the most devastating impacts of the climate crisis. That's according to a new report by more than 100 scientists released on day 6 of COP27. Researchers say that CO2 emissions from fossil fuels are on course to rise by 1% in 2022 to 37 billion tonnes, the highest level ever. That's largely driven by the number of people flying again after the pandemic. Experts say the increase in CO2 is threatening to derail a key climate goal to cut emissions in half by 2030 to limit the rise in global temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The report says there's a 50% chance the world will cross that crucial threshold soon.
Well, Flavien Joubert is the Minister for Agriculture, Climate Change and Environment on the small island nation of the Seychelles. I asked him about his expectations from major world powers at COP27.
We are looking very closely at what they are coming up with. Even now, very soon, we'll have a declaration from the President of the United States, and we have to look at what concrete actions they'll be bringing forward. But as we all know, it's always good for people to come together and acknowledge that we have a problem, and then we'll look at how we can solve those problems. So it's important they are here.
In terms of acknowledging those problems, I mean, there's been extreme weather, rising tides, and the reality for small islands like the Seychelles is pretty stark if action isn't taken. Your home could effectively disappear, couldn't it?
Yes, we have islands that are low-lying, and we are very, very concerned with the changes that are happening in those localities. And we fear, as you mentioned, that some of we have would actually disappear under the sea in the coming years. And we're not looking at timelines of 50 or 100 years. We're talking in less than a decade. So we are very concerned that things could change very rapidly for us. And also we've seen a lot of rapid onset events that worries us a lot because we've seen it in various parts of the world. And we worry that we would also be struck by one of those rapid onset events that might actually decimate the country and take us back in terms of development and take out a large chunk of our GDP.
You talk about it being important that countries are coming together and that the conversation is continuing, but that it's really about action. So what would make this a good COP? Is it about climate finance, loss and damage, that elusive 1.5 degrees which the world is not on target to hit? Talk me through it.
Well, I think we have to go back to why we are here. That's the most important thing. We are here to try and prevent us from going headlong into a world that would not be suitable for human life and for life as we know it on planet Earth. So we are here to try and prevent a big catastrophe. And every effort that we make, every decision that we make, have to fit in with that plan. Of course, loss and damage is a concern for us. Keeping 1.5 degrees alive is a concern. Increase in finance for adaptation and for mitigation and transition within different countries, especially island states, are important. Cutting back on those initiatives that's been gaining a lot of traction recently, for example, going back to coal by some countries would be very important for us. But we have to get back to the main storyline, which is let us try and arrest this change in the climate now before it is too late.
But lots of promises have already been made before at previous COPs, back in COP26 in Glasgow last year, for example. There have been some major distractions, if you want, since then. I'm thinking the war in Ukraine, the cost of living crisis. Do you worry that there's been too much of a diversion of resources because of those other things happening?
Yes, of course. It's something that has grabbed the attention of many leaders around the world. And of course, because of the consequences of those things, many countries have turned to those other issues, other distractions that you mentioned. But we have to stay on track regardless, because climate is more of an existential threat to everyone.
There have been daily climate protests in many countries since the start of COP27. In the latest direct action, Greenpeace activists have scaled Germany's transport ministry in Berlin. A recent poll suggests that most Germans think the demonstrations go too far in disrupting normal life. Our correspondent Peter Oliver is in Berlin. So, Peter, what has the government said about these protests, and how does the public feel?
Well, the German government has been actively trying to discourage some of these more disruptive protests that we've seen taking place. That includes the ones where people have been supergluing their heads and hands to the motorways and byways and highways around Berlin. What we saw on Friday was a Greenpeace protest to climb up the building, which is just over my right shoulder. You can't really see it now because they've all gone home for the evening and it's in the darkness right now. But yeah, he climbed up there in protest against what he sees as the criminalisation of climate activism and wanting to see a speed limit put on Germany's infamously or famously, however you look at it, speed-free autobahns, higher taxes on larger vehicles, and money that's been set aside by the Transport Ministry for expanding the motorway system to be used on expanding the rail network system. Now, I'll go back to that first point that the protesters said that they had about the criminalisation of climate activism. This is because one of the other elements that the government has involved has been the use in some German states, or the approval and amendment of laws in some German states that allows them to essentially detain any protesters they suspect of being about to plan immensely disruptive protests for up to 30 days. Now, these rules of preemptive detention without any type of judicial process have been incredibly criticised, not just here in Germany, but also around wider Europe. So they've been looked at as well. Now, in terms of the public opinion, the latest polls show that 83% of those, that was polled by the German TV channel ZDF, 83% said they'd gone too far in the protest that they carried out. Only 14% supported them. When you look at what has really been the turning point, it was one protest by the group Last Generation, in which they've been supergluing themselves to highways and byways. It was in Berlin last month, where a cyclist died because the ambulance weren't able, the emergency services weren't able to get to the scene after they'd been involved in a collision with a cement truck. That was due in part to the disruption caused by one of these protests. It's really turned public opinion.
And Peter, it's not just Germany where we're seeing these climate protests. They're happening across Europe.
Well, that's right. Just about anywhere you go, whether it's in France, Spain, Italy, just about anywhere, art has been one of the big targets here in Germany as well. The works of Claude Monet, Leonardo da Vinci and Vincent van Gogh have all had various things either thrown at them, or people stuck themselves to them, or to the glass covers that have covered over them. In Vienna, what we saw was the Natural History Museum targeted, where dinosaur skeletons, the fossils of dinosaurs, were targeted as protesters superglued themselves to those. The fossils were superglued. They superglued themselves to fossils to protest against fossil fuels. And of course, in London, I'm sure I don't need to tell either of you two that there has been major disruptions caused by the group Just Stop Oil. They spray painted buildings orange, also blockading the M25 motorway, that major highway artery for the British capital.
OK, Peter, thank you very much. Our correspondent Peter Oliver in Berlin.
Climate issues are also in focus at this year's Paris Peace Forum. CGTN spoke to Huang Huihiao, president of the Center for China and Globalization, about China's role in the global fight to tackle climate change.
China has already produced a state-of-the-art clean technology, clean energy technology, and that can be really utilized to benefit the world. And I think that the world will benefit from this kind of achievement China has. And China also launched the Belt and Road Initiative, which is also a large component of that will be green Belt and Road and green financing and green technology. China has already announced China will no longer finance any thermal coal-fired plants in any other developing country now. China will stop that. Already made a very strong commitment on that. AIIB, which is a bank that on Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, also announced China. AIIB will also stop thermal plant financing anywhere in the world. So that's really all those good things demonstrate China has the capability, determination, and China is willing to work with all the other countries, international community, NGOs, and civil society to achieve that common objective and consensus.
Still ahead on CGTN. Consumers prioritise pets, hobbies and investment over impulse buys during China's biggest annual shopping festival.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliet Mann. Welcome back. Now remember, CGTN is available to watch for free on all the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online on Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
China has further eased COVID restrictions for travellers arriving from abroad. Quarantine periods are being shortened from 10 to 8 days, and foreign travellers now only need to provide one negative test before boarding a plane instead of two. Hu Naijun is from the Chinese Academy of Sciences and has been telling CGTN why the rules have been scaled back.
We can say some measures are less tough as it used to be. Well, for example, the less quarantine days and the less people will be quarantined in the future. But in my opinion, I think we should keep it in mind that we are still in the pandemic period. And in this articles, we can see clearly that China will not lie down facing this pandemic, just like some other countries. So I think, in my opinion, we are still sticking to the dynamic zero policy. But I think I want to use two words. We will take more scientific and accurate way. For example, the incubation period of the Omicron variant is much less than the original variant or the Delta. So we can have less quarantine days. And from the Omicron's point of view, we can see that people who are infected do not have lung problems. The Omicron variant only attack the throat or the respiratory systems. So we will have this new measure on the foundations of this scientific and accurate reasons. So I think we shouldn't say we will let down, but I think the new measures are more scientific and accurate. People who are going abroad or go domestic travels will have less and less preparations to take. I think that is incentives for people to travel, not only internationally, but also domestically. So that's, at least in my opinion, a good news for the tourist industry.
Asian stock markets saw their biggest rally since March, following that news of China's COVID restriction easing, as well as slower US inflation data overnight. China's Shanghai Composite climbed about 1.7% to finish at more than 3,000 points. The Hang Seng, that one jumped 7.7% to over 17,000 points. And let's have a quick look at Japan's Nikkei. That closed up nearly 3%. Well, Hong Kong is slashing its economic growth forecast this year. Officials expect its economy will continue to struggle amid surging global interest rates and the continued impact of COVID-19. Our correspondent Richard Kimber reports.
The Hong Kong government expects growth to fall 3.2% this year. That's worse than previous predictions and marks the third time that officials here have downgraded their expectations for the year. Hong Kong's third quarter GDP shrank 4.5% as the city struggled to recover from more than 2 years of COVID-19 restrictions. And the government says growth has also been hampered by surging global inflation, rising global interest rates, and that's all dampened demand for Hong Kong exports. Hong Kong is specifically under pressure from any interest rate hike by the US Federal Reserve because the city's currency is pegged to the US dollar. The Finance Secretary here, Paul Chan, says that it is difficult to be optimistic about near-term growth, but he's promising to increase investment in the city to attract business and talent to Hong Kong. That's part of a wider government campaign to try to make sure that Hong Kong retains its status as an international financial hub despite all of these COVID-19 and macroeconomic pressures. It's reduced COVID-19 restrictions and pretty much eased inbound travel restrictions in recent months. That's allowed 2 large-scale events to take place just in the last week that would have been more difficult earlier this year. The first of those, a global financial summit attracting some of the world's biggest business leaders, and the go-ahead for the famous Hong Kong Rugby Sevens event. Both of these are seen as signals of what's to come in the coming months as Hong Kong continues to open up to the rest of the world. There is, though, concern from economists that despite efforts to stimulate spending here from more consumption voucher spending measures rolled out by the government and other public spending measures, that until there is a full-scale return of the likes of which we used to see before the COVID-19 pandemic, of masses of international business travellers and tourists coming to the city, particularly from the Chinese mainland, that until that time comes, it may be difficult for the city's economy to stabilise and enjoy a full-scale recovery. Richard Kimber for CGTN in Hong Kong.
China and the world's biggest annual shopping festival, known as Double 11, regularly smashes sales records. This year's bonanza will likely be no exception. Analysts expect it to rack up $140 billion in sales for the first time.
Pre-sales figures already suggest that will be the case, with e-commerce platforms offering attractive discounts for eager customers. Our correspondent Sao Bing reports.
Amazing discounts and deals on great products. The annual Double 11 shopping festival is always the time for consumers to get their favorite stuff at the best price.
Well, despite tempting prices, people this year are going for more rational choices rather than impulsive buying. So in that case, what are they really willing to put into their cart and pay for?
Believe it or not, pet supplies top the list. According to China Animal Agriculture Association, there were over 58 million pet cats and 54 million pet dogs in the country's urban areas in 2021, and many of their owners are more than willing to splurge on their furry friends in addition to basic needs like food and medical care. Many pet brands have had an outstanding pre-sale performance. One of them is animal health brand Zoetis. The company's sales in the first 80 minutes surpassed its total Double 11 income last year. Another brand, Python, reached 10 million RMB in pre-sales in the first hour alone. The industry is emerging as one of the most competitive ones in this year's online shopping carnival. Second, outdoor gears. Hiking, river tracing, star watching in a tent hotel. In recent years, outdoor activities has become very popular in China, partly because of the COVID-19 pandemic. The rising popularity has pushed up sales of related products.
Meanwhile, Tmall has also released an online metaverse shopping system where the outdoor activity lovers can choose and get their favorite products in a 3D world with just moves of their fingers.
And third is gold. Purchasing gold has always been popular as many consider it a good investment. With special discounts, gold accessories as well as products co-branded with special IPs have been among the most desirable shopping items. Data from Tmall shows that as of 8 p.m. on November 1st, that is the first day of the festival pre-sale, gold sales increased by more than 30% compared to the same time last year, with 6 brands earning over 100 million RMB.
Pets, hobbies, and investments. The new trends in this year's Double 11 festival shows a major shift in the market, with consumers seeking a better quality of life. 曹bình, CGTN, Beijing.
Well, Lele Wang is an analyst at research firm Capronasia. I asked her how big Double 11 will be this year.
Well, there's still a couple hours left for the single event, so it's hard to say. But we are seeing a slow growth from last year's experience. So our best estimate would be probably around the similar size of last year, which is going to be $139 trillion.
So slowing growth, you say. Why is that?
I think there are a few aspects to look at that. So firstly is just its original size. It started from 2009, and after 14 years growth, the GMV grew from $8 million to $139 trillion last year. And the participation of this event, even in smaller cities like 4-tier, 5-tier cities, is super high, which leaves very limited room for the event to grow. And the second aspect is the current slowing down economy. This is not a happy topic, but globally, the economy is concerning, and we have seen a fall in customer confidence index, and not to mention a rise in the unemployment rate, especially in the young group. So all those together, this delayed affects the development of this event. And the third, I think, would be people's change in their shopping behavior. So instead of only looking at price, people are getting more rational after years of discussion around what we really get from this shopping event. So this rational behavior limits people's work, but this is a good trend because we know what we want and we buy what we need and we prepare for the future.
So Singles Day has become the biggest shopping event in the world. What does this growth in online shopping say about how we now like to shop?
I think fundamentally online shopping fits into people's modern lifestyle. You can scan products online, you can compare the price, the features, and you can make payments easily online too. You can complete the whole transaction, and not to mention that in China, the delivery service is super efficient. People can get their package delivered as fast as in just a couple hours, and regularly it would be like 1 to 2 days actually. So all those together means that people like online shopping for its convenience and ease. There are good sides about offline shopping. For example, you can feel, you can experience, and you can meet people. But especially during the COVID control period, this became less and less important.
You're watching CGTN. Still to come. The Eurozone economy is predicted to beat expectations this year, but a recession looms for the UK. We'll take a look at the forecasts next.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you. All around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. When the storms come, we have to see the possibilities. Reinvent. Find new opportunities. Discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
What do we mean when we talk about the difference? The difference is in the detail, the background,
defense ministers from
the wider angle and perspective of every story. Wherever the story may be. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Juliette Mann and me, Robin Dwyer. The headlines again. Doubling down on climate commitments, President Joe Biden says the US will meet its emissions targets by 2030. And Asian shares soar after China eases some of its COVID restrictions.
Recession looms in the UK after the economy shrank 0.2% during the 3 months from July to September, as soaring prices hit businesses and households. Finance Minister Jeremy Hunt has warned that the tough road ahead will require extremely difficult decisions. Let's talk to Mark Oswald, Chief Economist and Global Strategist at ADM ISI. Good to see you again, Mark. So the UK is heading into recession. No real surprise there. Will it be very challenging, as the Bank of England suggests, or is there anything here to smile about?
I think there's two ways of looking at this. The Bank of England's forecast is probably too pessimistic. That said, I can see the UK economy stagnating or shrinking modestly for a protracted period of time, perhaps 12 to 18 months. Much of that really depends on what Mr. Hunt announces next week and what goes on elsewhere, particularly in Europe and in North America.
Speaking of which, why is the UK struggling more than other large economies?
I think that some of this is optical. You have to, the better performance from Germany in the third quarter of this year really is just testament to the weaker performance in previous quarters. There's a lot of base effects involved. Essentially, most of the countries in Europe are in a similar sort of place, particularly in Northern Europe. So France, Germany, the one exception is the Netherlands, because they're benefiting hugely from the imported gas trade. But otherwise, most economies are struggling because of inflation, above all. And to a certain extent, because of the slowdown in demand in China. I mean, that's particularly hitting German economy. So the UK, I would say, is to a certain extent suffering more because inflation is slightly higher, but it's really very fractional. But also, it's got this whole problem with a very small workforce, and a workforce which basically at the moment isn't big enough to accommodate companies that are in a better place and want to expand because they simply can't find the staff. And that's actually proving to be quite a headwind. It's more of a headwind in the UK than it is in most other places in the world, where it is also a headwind.
Now, you mentioned the much-delayed autumn statement, which we're going to hear at the beginning of next week. Jeremy Hunt, the Finance Minister, has talked about eye-watering decisions that will need to be made, tax rises, spending cuts. What's it going to take to restore confidence and economic stability?
I think the first thing, actually, ironically, is not necessarily what Mr. Hunt announces, which will be sensible, at least as against what was announced by Ms. Truss's government, but more whether the ruling Conservative Party actually backs Mr. Sunak and Mr. Hunt. Because if they go into another bout of internecine warfare, then the confidence in the UK will remain undermined.
Mark Oswald, Chief Economist at ADM ISI, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Brussels is forecasting the Eurozone economy to grow more than expected this year, followed by a sharp deceleration in 2023. But despite predictions of a looming recession, the European Commission says there'll be little impact on the jobs market or on public finances. Our correspondent Rosie Burchard is in Brussels for us. So, Rosie, a sharp slowdown on the cards. What's behind it?
Well, as the sun sets here in Brussels, rather a gloomy economic outlook outlined by officials here. Now, while the EU said that growth is actually going to be higher than expected in this year, that was driven, it says, by EU consumers going back out to buy more and spend more as COVID-19 restrictions were eased earlier in this year. And, of course, holidaymakers making their way back to EU tourist destinations in the summer. But now EU Economy Commissioner Paolo Gentiloni says that this really is a turning point, and he is predicting that there will be contraction both in the fourth quarter of this year and the first quarter of next year. And of course that means that recession is set to return to the EU. Take a listen to what Commissioner Gentiloni had to say.
But the forces driving the post-pandemic expansion have now largely faded away, and the shocks unleashed by the war and the broad-based slowdown in external demand are taking the upper hand. As inflation has continued to surprise on the upside, the sharp erosion of purchasing power has shifted consumer sentiment dramatically.
Paolo Gentiloni said inflation was surprising forecasters here. Well, indeed, inflation has hit an all-time high in the Eurozone, these 19 countries which use the euro currency. According to the latest flash estimates, it's in double digits at 10.7%. Now, according to the latest forecast, inflation will continue to rise but peak by the end of this year. They'll remain high in 2023 at around between 6 and 7% before returning to what would be considered a more normal level in 2024. And of course, the European Central Bank has been progressively hiking interest rates to try and tame this runaway inflation. And that's making borrowing more expensive. And all this, of course, means that people have less money to spend and that businesses are struggling. And that's, of course, driving partly why the European Commission is now expecting the economies to slow down substantially over the winter months which are approaching.
So some fairly gloomy predictions then. Is there any positive news in the forecast?
Well, important to say that while the EU predicts a technical recession, so two progressive quarters of negative growth, they are also expecting that overall in 2023 there will be growth, but only of 0.3%. That is much less than the 1.5% that had been previously forecast. Beyond this, the EU says that its job market is the bright spot in its economy. That's because despite all these challenges, unemployment remains at record lows. But of course, for many workers here in the European Union, things don't feel so bright. Just in the last few days, we've seen staff walk out in strikes across France and Belgium asking for more support with the cost of living, the rising cost of living, which they say amounts to a cost of living crisis.
Rosie, thank you very much. Our correspondent Rosie Burchard in Brussels.
We've talked about the UK economy, the Eurozone economy, so let's see what's happening in the United States. And the FTX cryptocurrency exchange is filing for bankruptcy following days of turmoil over its finances. And that's rocked the crypto market. Separately, Elon Musk has hinted of the possibility of bankruptcy at Twitter amid an exodus of senior executives. Let's talk to our correspondent, John Terrett, who's at the New York Stock Exchange for us. Good to see you, John. So let's start with this crypto crisis. What's the latest?
Well, Juliet and Robin, this is getting very serious here. It is a worry from Wall Street to Washington, D.C. The background is FTX, the primary cryptocurrency exchange, was found to be insolvent earlier this week. A Chinese company called Binance stepped in to try and save them, took one look at the books and walked straight back out the door again. And now today, as you say, amid this cryptocurrency crisis we find ourselves in, Sam Bankman-Fried, who is the face of cryptocurrency in America, a guru for cryptocurrency, a man who spent a lot of time lobbying in Washington, D.C. on behalf of various forms of crypto. A man not universally liked, however, has resigned from his job as the CEO of the company he founded, FTX, and this gold standard crypto company has now filed for bankruptcy protection. And that means that people who invested with this company in any way have pretty much lost everything. It's obviously up to the judges now, but they're likely to get what the Americans term cents on the dollar back, C-E-N-T-S, cents on the dollar back. They're going to get a fraction of what they had invested. FTX has been dialing for dollars in the last couple of days, trying to get somebody to rescue them. Nobody will. This means there are now very serious calls for regulation for cryptocurrency. And I've told you many times on this program to be careful. I've said it's not the Wild West, it's the wild, wild, wild West, and this is now turning out to be true. I don't think crypto is over, Juliet, but I think in the future it's going to be heavily regulated by governments. It's going to rely on audits, and the most important difference will be that anybody investing with these companies, there's going to have to be proof that there's a dollar sitting there for every dollar that anybody invests, just like we have now with banks and insurance products. And you say, well, what's wrong with that? The answer is nothing really, but it's the opposite of what the crypto fans have been hoping to create. Julia?
Well, something else that you've talked about quite a lot on our programme is Twitter and Elon Musk.
I know.
He's talking bankruptcy.
Well, I know. How ironic is that? And this is coming out of Bloomberg this morning, reporting that he's apparently talking to staff about possible bankruptcy sometime next year. Over at Twitter, it comes as executives and advertisers continue to pull out. And it comes a day after he emailed the whole staff and said, look, you've got to come to the office 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. He's actually ended working from home. Now, one of the great unspoken truths about Twitter was, and I have said this on our program before, there was never anybody there. And they're based in San Francisco, but they weren't there. You could see the tumbleweeds going down the corridors and in reception. They were all working from home. And Musk has tried to stop that. There is turmoil in the company at the moment because of the disruptor that he is. He says the content has improved since he took over. He says it can't be all about him. And he is looking for new streams of revenue for this company, moving away from advertising. That's why he's charging $8 for the tick, even though that's been postponed. And if you want to know what Twitter will look like, it will be like WeChat, the Chinese company, with a great payment service component to it, which Twitter doesn't currently have. Julia?
And still the big question about when it's ever going to start making money. John, let's talk about what's going on in stock markets. There's a bit of a rally again on Friday.
Yes. Well, there was, and there still is in two cases. The story is that after the consumer price inflation index came out yesterday and was way, way, way better than Wall Street had been expecting, really a lot better, there was a very, very strong rally yesterday. And it's hugely ironic because yesterday was the 247th birthday of the U.S. Marine Corps. And they had officers there ringing the closing bell. And somebody had produced a massive cake. And everyone was handing out cake to me and everybody else. And it felt like just the right moment to have a celebratory cake because the Dow closed up 1,201 points, 3.6%. NASDAQ was up 7%. S&P 500 up by 5%, the best for 2 years. And it's all because of that CPI number and the hope that it will calm the Federal Reserve down to reducing interest rates by less than had been previously thought on December the 14th. Now, today, we had a strong rally to begin with, but it's fizzling in the Dow's case, and that's because of the turning to bankruptcy protection for FTX. The Dow is now down 281 points, so, I mean, about a third of what it gained yesterday. The NASDAQ is up, though, and so is the S&P 500 by just a little bit. We have to, but this FTX story, you're going to have to watch this over the weekend because it's going to move, and we'll talk about it again on Monday.
I'm still thinking about the cake. I'm wondering, John, if it was pound cake. John Terry to the New York Stock Exchange. Thank you.
It was delicious.
Video has emerged of people greeting Ukrainian soldiers in the city of Kherson. It comes as Russia confirmed the total withdrawal of its troops from the region, which it had occupied since the start of the invasion. People can be heard chanting "Glory to Ukraine" as they raise their flag in Freedom Square. Ukraine's Defense Intelligence Agency says units of Ukrainian soldiers are entering the southern city and have told Russian troops there to surrender.
Russian delegates are meeting officials from the United Nations for talks over extending the Ukraine grain export deal, which is due to expire next week. President Putin briefly suspended Russia's participation in the scheme last month, claiming protected shipping corridors were being used to transport Ukrainian drones.
Russia has said it's not expecting a breakthrough in new talks with the United States over resuming nuclear arms inspections. Negotiations on reviving the so-called START nuclear treaty are due to take place in Cairo later this month. Inspections were halted in March 2020 due to the COVID pandemic. Earlier this year, but Russia suspended cooperation but insists it is still committed to complying with the treaty.
A ship carrying more than 200 migrants has docked in France after being turned away by Italy. The incident has sparked a war of words between Rome and Paris, with France accusing Italy of being selfish after the ship was stranded in the Mediterranean. Italy's Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, said she couldn't understand the French response.
I was struck by the reaction from the French government, which I think is incomprehensible and unjustified. What exactly makes them so angry? Should Italy be the only possible port of disembarkation for migrants in the Mediterranean? Because that's not written in any agreement.
Countries around the world are remembering their war dead on Armistice Day, which marks the end of World War I.
In recent years, more attention has been paid to the role of thousands of Chinese labourers who dug trenches and carried away the dead and injured from European battlefields. Each year, a ceremony is held to mark the day, organised by the Western Front Association. Our correspondent Andrew Wilson reports.
A different, but in recent times, growing group gathered at the cenotaph this year. The descendants and friends of the Chinese Labour Corps, the CLC, a hastily assembled unit of labourers who did their bit on the battlefields of World War I. 140,000 of them who worked with the French and the British right through the Great War, digging trenches, loading trains, carrying ammunition. It was hard work, but the men were selected for their toughness and shipped from their homes to an industrial war zone they could never have imagined. European army discipline could be tough.
My grandfather knew that if there had to be punishment meted out, there was a choice between having the labourer flogged or fined. So he went to the head ganger. He said, always flog, because though that sounds very brutal, he said that the labourers were here to make money, and a flogging would mean nothing to them.
But the workers were joined by fellow Chinese students in Europe who gave them language and culture classes in the camps.
So I think some of them did remarkable work in training them how to read and write and to understand European values, European customs.
There are some 2,000 graves across Europe's fields for those who died from bombs or disease. Most of the rest went home, eventually. The last surviving member died in France in 2002 at 106 years old. But now all their memories are preserved.
When we think about war, we tend to remember only the soldiers who took part in it. But we forget about all those who built up the logistical support, you know, the mappers, the home guards, and also the labourers who worked behind the lines digging the trenches.
Many countries lost people during the Great War. Now, unrecognised for many years, the men of the CLC can join the ranks of those officially remembered every year at the same time, 11 a.m. on the 11th day of the 11th month, Armistice Day. As the time grows more distant, more communities are being included in a ceremony that was once the exclusive preserve of English nationals. It might now be becoming more of a family. Andrew Wilson, CGTN, Westminster.
You're watching CGTN. Still to come. Lower petrol prices, but higher pollution levels. 1 year in, is Hungary's fuel price cap working?
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
Unprecedented scenes that we saw.
The cleanup operation is now well and truly underway.
Parts of southern Europe remain in a state of emergency.
Context gives meaning. People make history.
Far more than 1,000 people have come here today.
But authorities are still on high alert.
So now we've actually become the border on this road.
A complex world demands a comprehensive view.
But with the cleanup efforts more or less under control,
the economic impact is bound to ripple across the country.
There's plastic pollution everywhere.
Because the world today matters for your world tomorrow.
This is the living area of the crew.
The focus is firmly on future technologies.
Well, this is something completely different.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
This week on a Razor COP27 special, producing electricity by wind without turbines, an alternative method to achieving nuclear fusion, and creating a revolutionary construction material from fungi.
1 square meter of mycelium insulation produced can sequester 0.8 to 1.7 kilograms of carbon.
Welcome back. It's been almost a year since Hungary capped the price of fuel to shield consumers from some of the effects of rising inflation.
According to climate advocates and authorities in Budapest, the measure has kept prices down but has led to more cars on the road and increased air pollution. Our correspondent Pablo Gutierrez reports.
Cheap fuel has been flowing into Hungarian cars since the country first capped the price of diesel and petrol at $1.19 per liter in November last year, designed to help citizens with the rising cost of living. Hungary's Green Party says the measure is also having unintended consequences.
The gas consumption increased according to last year because of the gas cap, because what people are seeing that the gas is on sale and you're buying more.
It's thought Hungarians are buying more fuel and driving more. According to Global Traffic Index, a non-profit group that analyzes road congestion around the world, drivers in Budapest are spending more time stuck in traffic jams than in previous years. On average, they register 250 traffic jams per day during rush hour.
The number of cars, the sold cars, is rising every year. We have more than 700,000 cars registered only in Budapest.
Hungary's Clean Air Group says more cars on Budapest roads means more air pollution. The group fears air quality in Budapest could reach dangerous levels in the coming weeks due to CO2 emissions, along with the rising cost of natural gas, which could lead households to burn wood or waste for heat instead.
It's not logical to keep that cap on the petrol price, because it doesn't produce anything good for the people. They are using their vehicles. That's the only thing they can provide with it, so they can feel that everything is all right.
Hungary gets about 65% of its crude oil from Russia, an exception they fought hard for in the 7th round of EU sanctions against Moscow in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Hungary's Green Party says that another unintended consequence of the fuel price cap is that it only benefits people who own cars. They would like to see more funds going into public transportation to benefit and make it cheaper for people to travel around this country.
The party's goal is to cut the cost of monthly public transportation passes by almost 50% and allow them to be used everywhere. It says that would cut the cost of living and reduce car emissions.
Our experts are saying that the air pollution would decrease by 2% in Hungary in 1 year.
However, Prime Minister Viktor Orban and the governing Fidesz party are planning to extend the fuel cap, saying it will shield consumers' inflation now at a 2-decade high. For now, that may be good news for drivers, but environmentalists maintain it is short-sighted and unfair. Pablo Gutierrez, CGTN, Budapest.
Motorbike brand Ducati is still celebrating the weekend's win in the MotoGP, the premier road racing event. It's the first victory in 50 years for an Italian rider riding an Italian bike.
It's also a landmark year for the brand off the track, with China contributing to record sales. CGTN's correspondent Hermione Kitson has been speaking to Ducati's CEO and the world champion.
Days after being crowned the MotoGP world champion, Francesco Bagnaia says he's yet to realise the magnitude of the win.
Sincerely, after all these years, it's still difficult to understanding what we've done because it was an amazing result for all the team, for us. So I'm very happy, very proud of my team.
After a difficult start to the season, the 25-year-old sealed victory in the last race in Valencia on Sunday. It's the first time an Italian rider triumphed on an Italian bike in 50 years. Ducati CEO Claudio Domenicali says it's a moment of national pride.
And so the whole country now is like being on fire, you know, because everyone is very proud because they have the best rider, the best biker.
It's a stellar year for Ducati also off the track with record sales. China is the brand's fastest growing market.
We are very committed to China market because the potential is very high. And in China, we are the brand #1, okay, by all the motorcycle community.
Ducati is among more than 1,300 brands at this year's International Motorcycle and Accessories Exhibition in Milan, the industry's most important trade fair event.
The EICMA Expo dates back to 1914 and represents more than 45 countries. Ducati's success makes this year's event particularly special.
It's a success shared also with other motorbike brands. Even competitors have applauded Ducati, and we believe the Expo is a great way to sell Made in Italy worldwide.
Experts say the biggest challenge facing the industry is its green transition. Ducati's first electric bike is the Moto E.
The Moto E project for us is a kind of a testing project. We want to develop actually the competence. We want to touch ground in a real-life environment, not just in prototype.
In the meantime, the team has its sights on another victory at the Superbike World Championship in Indonesia on Sunday. Hermione Kitson, CGTN, Milan.
Europe.cgtn.com has all the week's top stories from China. Here's a quick take.
Participants from almost 150 countries were joined by a team of robot helpers at the 2022 China International Import Expo. The groundbreaking J-20 stealth fighter ran through its paces at the China Air Show. More than 100 other civilian and military aircraft were also on display. China's carbon market covers 4.5 billion tons of carbon dioxide emissions 1 year after its launch, making it the biggest in the world. China's digital economy now accounts for more than 40% of GDP, with the e-commerce industry surging in value. Over 55% of China's mangroves are protected and is one of the few countries which is growing the area covered by the wetlands, that's according to a new report. And the Beidou satellite navigation system is being used in more than half of the world's countries and in 95% of China's exported smartphones.
Our headlines again. Doubling down on climate commitments, President Joe Biden says the US will meet its emissions targets by 2030.
Asian shares soar after China eases some of its COVID restrictions.
And recession looms for the UK as the economy starts to shrink. The Bank of England says it could last 2 years.
That's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching.
More on all our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps, Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app. And in the UK, we're on Freeview.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again on Monday, same time, same place. From all the team here in London, goodbye.
Goodbye.